Hello, happy Monday. My name is Stuart DeQ. I'm the program director at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. Welcome to CBay Community Lunch. So every 2 weeks at the center, we'll host a conversation or an activity on career paths, on programs and activities that are going on at Yale. And this is one that we also are really excited to make live and open to the broader public. So everybody will see Matt and Ray in the back and wave to our audience online. Hello. Welcome to Yale. We will be broadcast online, so when we get to the question and answer section, we'll be using mics and make sure that we are using those so that everyone online can also hear the conversation as well, or hear the questions. I'm going to be very brief in the introduction here. If you guys can feel in the room, it's a little chilly, so make sure you're continuing to move around. We thought this would be a great opportunity for everybody to keep on their Patagonia gear rather than heating the room. You guys can wear the fleeces. Last year in the spring, we hosted the kickoff of John Fullerton's work, Regenerative Capitalism, done through the Capital Institute. I'll introduce John in a second. And it was a conversation, John presented it, was a conversation between him and Vincent. And after the discussion, a number of students came up and looked at, came up and reached out to us and said, I spend all day sitting down figuring out, whether I'm at the School of Forestry figuring out how to solve the world's problem through science, or I'm at the School of Management figuring out how to do it through a spreadsheet. And I don't pick my head up to think about the broader issues or problems or challenges that are going on. And this was one of the first discussions that I had that really challenged me again to think about, why am I getting this education? Why am I here? And how do I want to move forward? And we were thrilled with that response, and we wanted to continue that dialogue. And we're just, ecstatic that Vincent and John want to continue that with us. So today's event is the journey toward and beyond sustainability, how two distinct business paths led to a common realization. And the tagline we had for the event, I think, summarizes it really well. One man came to business through Wall Street, another through a California mountaineering company with surfer employees. Yet both arrived at the realization that the business model of the future needs to cooperate with nature, respect life, and serve people. This is really one of the other ways that I think that isn't incorporated in that description we have to move forward is uncommon collaborations and ways of people kind of giving of their time and insight and energy in different ways. And Vincent has been incredibly generous. He is a visiting fellow at the School of Management, has been working with us through the past year, and will continue in the coming year, engaging with students, working on projects here. John, as well, of offering his time, energy, and effort to student projects here at the Center, of advising people, of sharing his insight through regenerative capitalism, and continuing a dialogue, and particularly how do you, reshape the broader system. So we're thrilled to have them both here. They're going to do a longer exploration and introduction of their own journeys and why they're here. But many thanks for you all joining us today, and let's get started with the conversation.
We were going to flip a coin to see who goes first, but I don't think either one of us has a coin on him. So, I think you should go first, John.
He's the boss. So the first thing to be said, can you hear me? Is that working? The first thing to be said certainly is that spending one's career in a California business where the employees are surfers sounds like a lot more fun than where I spent 20 years of my beginning of my career, so you know who the smart one here is. But we thought we'd start just by telling a little bit of our own story, and then save plenty of room in the conversation for a discussion. So this will be sort of a shorthand version, but just to give you some context. So I graduated from undergraduate school in 1982. People always say I look young, so I'm older than I look. I'm an old man. And basically caught the wave when derivatives were just invented. And it was a fascinating time. Derivatives were an exciting new technology that you basically needed to know how to run a spreadsheet to be able to work in the derivatives business, which created this great disequalizer between my generation and anyone who was 2 to 10 years older than me. And I lived in Tokyo, London, New York, and moved across all the different capital markets, managing various parts of JP Morgan's derivative business. And in truth, around 1995, actually, what I should also say is when I was in college, I took a course called the Economics of International Relations. And the idea was that economics would determine the future course of international relations rather than politics. And that was like the one course I took as an undergrad that really resonated and stuck with me. It stuck with me to this day. And so the reason I went to work at JP Morgan, which was then called Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, which was a commercial bank at the time, was not the reasons why people go to work on Wall Street today. I was pretty naive about making money and all that stuff. I genuinely had this passion to work on kind of global development, economic development, and if you had asked me when I was 25 where I thought I was going with my career, it would be I'm learning about finance and someday I'm going to go work at the World Bank to, quote, save the world. And in fact, the first CEO of Morgan that I worked under, that was his path. So Morgan was kind of a very prestigious place, and it wouldn't have been unnatural for someone to go from a successful career at Morgan into something like, you know, a senior role in the World Bank or the IFC. One of my bosses ended up running the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. But that was sort of what I was thinking when I was 25, and of course things change and things happen the way you don't anticipate them. And what happened to me was that the derivatives business was invented that totally revolutionized finance. It essentially connected all domestic capital markets through arithmetic, through math, into one global market. So we were at the cusp and the beginning of this whole idea of globalization that really happened in finance back in the late 80s, early 90s. And but as the business matured and it got more of a, you know, blocking and tackling, tough competitive thing as opposed to a creative thing, I got bored with it, to be honest. I got tired of managing markets businesses, which is a grind and a bit of a fight. And I managed to convince the firm to let me learn how to invest capital in the private equity group. And back in '97, picked the alternative energy sector and the education sector as the areas to focus on, largely because I had this desire to align capital and purpose, but also because no one else was covering those areas and there was room to do it. So I then kind of caught on to what we now call impact investing before it was a thing. And then when the merger with Chase happened in 2001, I just left. And it was clear that the culture was going to change. I didn't like the whole setup of who they wanted me to report to, and I was frankly having questions about the role of finance in the world, and it enabled me to kind of create some space for myself to think about that and think about, in a sense, what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I was actually quite, I wasn't anxious, but I was unsettled, because when you're 41, you're supposed to be in the prime of your career and driving hard, and I had more and more questions at that point about what I was doing and what I wanted to do. So I left in the spring of 2001 with no real plan, and the first day I was back downtown. Morgan's offices used to be down on Wall Street, and the first day I had a meeting downtown was a beautiful day like this in September in 2001. And right when we got to City Hall, this guy comes in the subway and announces they just flew a plane into the Trade Center. So I got to the street right after the second plane hit, and that obviously will do a real number on your psyche. And because I didn't have a job, I had lots of time to think about this. And my conclusion from it was that this was not only an act of evil, but that it was sort of a bigger signal that something big is shifting, and we didn't understand what it was. And that's what pushed me into literally years of study and reading books, and that's when I learned about the ecosystem crisis as a systemic issue for the first time. I had no idea before that. I remember reading articles about the owl or the individual species, save the whale, but I didn't get that they were connected systemic crises, and I certainly didn't get that they were connected to the economy. And so after reading probably 50 books over the next 5 years, probably more, I came to the realization that it's the economic system that's driving all of these ecosystem crises, not really by design, but by unintended consequence. And as a finance guy, I understood very well that it's finance that drives the economy. So I literally remember sitting, looking in the mirror one day, kind of pointing the finger at me, thinking, you're a young whippersnapper, think you're so smart, and you have no idea how what your craft does influences and affects everything that really matters. And so that was sort of an existential crisis, I guess you could say, and not easy to process. Most of my friends started thinking I was a bit nuts. But to wrap up, I think, by the time the financial crisis hit, my confidence in this thinking was greater, and then suddenly it became even more obvious that something was fundamentally wrong. And in fact, the behavior that on Wall Street that led to the financial crisis was something totally out of my own experience. I was as shocked about that as any other observer. It was like, what happened to that place, the place that I used to work? And I'm not saying that Wall Street was filled with Boy Scouts when I was there, but the scale and arrogance and violence that was represented by the behavior was something out of my own experience. And that was only, 7 years after I left. So I've come to the belief that we're in it, it's not coming, we're in the midst of a very profound transformation. And that at the root of it is a profound transformation of how we think about finance and money. And that we need to look to the systems that we know are sustainable to learn, rather than invent our own theories out of thin air that are flawed, which is the basis of economics and finance, in my opinion, are built on theories that are flawed. And I could pretty much prove that to you with more time. And so the joint degree between the environmental school and the business school is exactly, the place where this new creative thinking needs to occur. But as some of the students had mentioned, it's really hard to do that because we operate in this reductionist, specialist silo mode. And so, at any rate, I think where you're at, and then, figuring out what to do with this education is, it's as exciting as anything that humanity has ever faced, but it's equally as challenging as anything humanity's ever faced, with very profound consequences. So, at any rate, that's now my work for the rest of my life, and I look forward to having you guys figure it out, because I know I can't.
My story was a little different. I grew up in California in the 60s. And 1968, 1969 was a time of profound disruption. And for those of us who were involved in kind of I helped run an alternative high school and ran a newsletter on alternative education and did some other things, including being an intern in a psychodrama theater. So for the kind of life I was leading, what looked like a conventional career didn't look like it was going to happen for anyone in 1968 or 69, when everything was so disrupted. And I was going to become a writer. That was the one thing I knew. And I had done all these interesting things. There was a bad recession. I ended up working in a car wash. Alvito's Pit Stop Gas and Wash number 2 on Milpa Street. And I had an uncle who ran a small climbing equipment company 30 miles down the road, and got a postcard from my grandmother, whose English was her second language, and it was one sentence: "Why don't you ask your uncle for a job? He pays his men $3 an hour." So I I found out that he paid $2.25 an hour. But I went to work, and there were a couple of things that I discovered. One is I didn't much like school, but I did love to work. I loved the culture of climbers. As a writer, the climbers were independent, autonomous. There was no hierarchy in the yard. The equipment, the climbing equipment, had a reputation for being the best in the world, so that really appealed to me, that it was high-quality stuff. And I found that I really liked business. So a job I intended to hold for 3 months and then go travel again in Europe ended up being more or less a 43-year project. The culture, I think, was quite different from Wall Street. When I first worked, I used to get a bonus for every week that I worked 40 hours. Because the climbers and the surfers tended to go away for the weekend and not come back till Tuesday. And because I didn't surf, I actually answered the phone when the waves were good. And so I was made sales manager shortly before my 21st birthday and kept that job for 20 years. What appealed to me about the company, I ended up loving business, and I loved growing this little company, especially when we got into clothing. I loved the challenge of getting everything made and sold, which was my end of the business. And we also became a rather hot commodity in the 80s, so we were growing very quickly. It was very challenging. There was no understanding when we got started in the 80s about the environmental crisis, and no feeling of responsibility for our actions as a manufacturer, or our actions as a company with a very deep supply chain, which we started to have when we got into clothing. The climbing equipment used to be made mostly in our yard or overseas in someone's yard where you could see what was going on. But clothing, you ordered cotton, you didn't order anything. We sent specs to a factory in Hong Kong. They ordered the cotton from a broker. The broker arranged whoever the spinner and the weaver and the knitter would be, and then they would deliver a product to our specifications. And all of that stuff was basically hidden to us. At the same time, although we had took no responsibility for what was done in our name in the supply chain, because we were a group of climbers and surfers, there was a strong sense of what it was like to be in the wild, of what the experience was, which was quite humbling if you get to be a mile from the road or out in the waves, and a strong desire to protect those places. And so we started in the mid-1980s to give 1% of sales to grassroots environmental groups. And really grassroots. Nobody else was giving money to these people. We were giving money to people who were protecting a particular forest or a stretch of river or a surf break. And often these groups would have 2 or 3 employees and have a budget of $500,000 a year, something like that, about the size of a neighborhood church. That became our kind of first sense of responsibility. And for me, I wanted to because what we're getting around to is this sense of how did we end up as a manufacturer, as a clothing company in the same place as John? And part of it, I think, came from this sense of environmental awareness, of the sense of environmental crisis, that people who spend a lot of time outdoors could have more easily than people who spend a lot of time in the city. Because the climbers would go back to a mountain and find that the glacier had receded by 20 or 25% since they were last there. Surfers were always fighting developers over breaks. In the 1970s, 1,000-year-old sequoias in the Sierras were dying from the smog generated by LA. One of the things I'm kind of alternating between the company story and my story, one of the things that I noticed particularly, one of the things that was critical for my education was that as I started to love being in the business, I became very conservative. Not politically, but about acting on behalf of the business so that we didn't risk it. And what I started to discover is that I was wrong about that. That if you really want to have a good business, there are times when you should take certain risks, not only in terms of business risks directly in the products you make, but also other kinds of risks. We, in the very early 80s, instituted daycare, on-site daycare, because we had working mothers working in the store sewing packs. And it was something that several of us on the business side were opposed to, because we thought, we're not big enough for this. We're too small. This is too expensive. And it became very clear within a year after we opened up the daycare center how wrong those of us who had been opposed were, because it really made a difference, both in terms of employee retention. It made a difference in terms of the feel of the business. It really felt like a community when you had the kids around. It really made a difference for the mothers and the fathers to be able to see their kids at noon or to take them home themselves if they got sick. That was an education for me. It was also an education for me very deep education when we went through the whole switch to organic cotton. Because one of the things we had to do was persuade our own employees that this was a move that would be good for the company. But you had, when we made the switch to organic cotton, we had recognized, we'd undertaken a study of the 4 major fibers we used, and we found out how harmful chemically made grown cotton was. So we decided to go organic in an 18-month period, and we had the resources. We had bought up enough cotton in the San Joaquin Valley to make our line. But we hadn't really gone deeply into the infrastructure, because what happened is if we weren't buying cotton from a broker, we were now buying it from farmers. We didn't guarantee their loans, but we did everything else. And those farmers didn't have any contacts with a spinner or with knitters and weavers. So we had to basically develop a whole new infrastructure. And you've got people who are working, who are designing your line for the next season. They've got to do everything they had to do the day before. They've got to do the coloring. They've got to order the sales samples. They've got to do the specs. And all of a sudden you're saying, oh, by the way, find us an entire new infrastructure. And, do it in your spare time. So we had a little bit of a revolt. And what happened is the employees came to us and said, there is not a single customer who's asking for this. Nobody's asking for organic cotton. We're way ahead of the market. Nobody cares about this except us. And you're putting an unbearable burden on your workforce. The people who had actually seen what goes on cotton farms were really convinced that this was important. So that's what we did is we hired buses and we took people 30 at a time out to the Central Valley, took them to a conventional cotton field and then to an organic field. When you got to the conventional field, the first thing you noticed when you opened the door to the bus was the smell, because it smelled of the chemicals. They're basically nerve gases that were developed World War I and World War II. You noticed that there were no birds. You noticed that there was no other ground cover. There were no earthworms. It was basically a dead environment. The plants are kind of held mechanically in place and fed fertilizers, and that's what keeps them growing. And then we went to the organic farm, and it was like a real field. There were birds. There were things growing on the ground. There were worms. There's a kind of a critical thing. There's a woman who still works at Patagonia and still works in the child care center who had just had her first baby, and she went on the conventional tour. They went out to the gin, the cotton gin, where they separate the oil from the fiber. And she said, oh, what happens to that oil? This was the conventional with the smell going. And I said, oh, that goes into food. Potato chips, mayonnaise. That became so well known that they now, it's pretty well concealed on labels. You never see cottonseed oil anymore. You see it under some other name. And after that, she never wanted to feed her kids anything but organic food. And the point of this story is not about what we did, but it's about, I think, what happens when you make something tangible that seemed abstract before. So before, for the employees, it was like, oh, you know, crazy Yvon, he wants to go to organic cotton in 18 months. And afterwards, after people actually saw the difference between these two farms, it was, you know, this is the right thing to do. This is hard, but this is the right thing to do. And it also became a kind of rallying point for the company rather than a sticking point. The other thing that made a difference for me over the years was telling impossible stories. And I'd say that the first difficult story to tell for me was, because I was at that point in kind of the chief storyteller for the catalog, was making it clear to customers why organic cotton had an advantage. Another challenge we faced later is when we decided to really pursue the idea of cradle to cradle, the William McDonough idea of having every bit of fiber that goes into clothing come out at the end and have the capacity to be made into new fiber of equal value. So we started doing that. We called it the Common Threads program. We do still collect back anything that we've ever made. But when we started in on that program, we said, listen, this is the wrong way to go about it. It's great to recycle, but should we be recycling things that have never been made? Should we be emphasizing only recycle when really it's the fourth R? It's reduce, repair, reuse, and recycle. And there's a reason to have those four in their proper order. And that's when we thought, oh, no problem, we'll increase our capacity to do repairs. No problem in terms of reuse, of getting people to recirculate clothing. We did a worn wear program. But the idea of reduce for a consumer products company was really kind of a challenge. And that's when 2011, we took out the ad that said, don't buy this jacket. In order not to ask our customers not to buy things, and not in order to goose our sales with a clever marketing tactic, but to change the conversation with the customer and ask them to look at what we knew to be the environmental and social cost of anything that's made. So we chose a really good product that could be recycled. It had recycled content, lasted a long time, could be recycled into something of equal value. But we also pointed out that it generated 23 times its weight in greenhouse gases, that it used enough water to meet the needs of a village for a day, generated 2/3 its weight in scrap. And if you look at anything that's manufactured, you'll see similar kinds of numbers. But this is not something that's part of the general awareness. So personally, what I saw, what I have continually learned from working at Patagonia. And I think my colleagues have continually learned from progressively finding new discoveries and then feeling the sense that we have to act on this. So that when we found out the problem with organic cotton, or with conventional cotton, we went organic. When we went deeply into recycling and said this is not enough, we were able to make the move. Each step of the way gave us confidence, and also each step of the way kind of lifted the veil more and more behind the to reveal the depth of the environmental and I think also a social crisis. So where that leaves us at this point as a company and as a group of people is we're kind of in the same place that John is. That we have a mission statement that we've had for 25 years that says build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm. But that mission statement is now truer of us now than it was 25 years ago. We've moved into that. But it's not enough just to do less harm. And what people talk about when they talk about sustainability is basically reducing the harm that the current system does. And what we really need to do when we have a crisis, an ecological and an economic crisis of this magnitude, is to start to look at activities that actually regenerate or restore the health of natural systems that underpin all of our industrial systems. And I think what we're seeing is we're at the cusp of a shift in stories, and this is going to be much more part of your life than it is going to be of mine. But the old story was basically we have the right as human beings to draw on and draw down our resources, and we'll always figure out a way to either substitute or to create a synthetic version of what we're taking from the earth. I think that there's been a undisputed assumption that economic growth of any kind is good for human development. That's how we progress as a species, and that assumption has been true of capitalism and is also true of socialism. It's true of democratic socialism, and it was also true of communism. And that assumption, I think, has to change. That the kind of growth that we're going to have, or that the kind of activity we have, has to have a component that helps restore natural systems. I think that's the new story is going to be one in which we look at the health and the vitality of all the natural systems that underpin our industrial systems, and that we learn how to work with those systems in order to achieve our human needs, whether through biomimicry or learn to work with nature rather than to extract from it. And I think that that's kind of the key to our future. And it will be part of your work. And it will have to be because the challenge is so great. Questions? Yeah.
You just shared, Vincent. So one is, and you said this, but just to reiterate it, this idea of regeneration has to apply, so it's a human economy that we're talking about. So it has to apply to the social challenges as much as the environmental challenges. It's not okay anymore to sort of have one group of people work on the environment and another group work on the social. They're integrally linked, and that's, I actually used to think that was too hard, and the more I've been thinking about it and the more I've been involved in real world challenges, the more I see that actually the potential to deal with these issues usually comes by working across those boundaries rather than viewing them as two separate things.
The interesting thing is economy and ecology come from the same root word, the same Greek word which means household.
The other point I want to just echo of what you said is you said at some point the importance of acting, and by knowing something that you then were forced to act on it. I think you were at the time talking about the organic cotton, and I think, you know, in many ways that's this waking up process that our society is going through, and the millennial generation is way more awake than my generation. I mean, many people who are in their 40s or 50s or 60s are so locked into the growth at all costs, that there's sort of like this law that this is how economics has to work. And if you challenge those assumptions, you're kind of challenging people's core identity. But if you notice something that isn't right, then you're already part of the solution. And this sort of the way I've experienced it is that it's not like a choice. Oh, I now understand something, so I can decide whether to ignore it or not. It becomes your purpose. And so as you think about the issues you're passionate about and see an opportunity to act, that's I suspect, what's going to lead us into this new way of this new story, because you're not going to have a choice to not act. You're going to act because that's the way the universe is allowing this to happen in many ways. So, just as Patagonia did.
Yeah, and that was our experience at Patagonia. Is that if you find something and you can do something about it, you really want to kind of tackle the next thing. And that seems to be human nature. Anyway, welcoming questions, comments, brickbats.
Hi. First of all, thank you for coming. This is great. My name is Sarah Balthrunas, and I'm a joint degree between the School of Forestry and the School of Management. John, I saw you also speak last year at the end of the year, give your presentation, and I agree with Stu's comments that it was a great conversation and a good awakening to consider the bigger picture. From your story today, it's apparent that your kind of awakening is unique, especially for someone in finance. And I'm curious, what do you kind of see as potentially the corollary to the showing people working in the clothing industry a conventional cotton operation versus an organic one, and that being their awakening? What do you see the corollary in the finance world? How do you kind of suggest that, not everyone can go through the same awakening you did, but how do you kind of bring people to that or take that next step?
So I used to spend a lot of time in conversations with Wall Street friends, colleagues, and I spend less time there than I used to. And I guess it's a conscious choice to, there's an expression, go where the flow is. The flow is not the leadership of this is not going to come, in my opinion, from the people leading Wall Street firms to have an epiphany. In part because it's really, really tough to run a Wall Street firm right now. You're just bombarded with crises and challenges and problems and headaches and regulations and P&L pressure and everything. And on top of all that, you're going to have some existential epiphany. It's just, even all the well-meaningness and right intention in the world, I think it's... So I think, in many ways, the old Wall Street is already in decline. And the opportunity is, impact investing is it's way more talk than it is action, but it's incredibly exciting relative to trading bonds on Wall Street. And so I think this is going to happen more from creating a new finance sort of out of whole cloth than it is putting bankers in buses and showing them something.
My name is Samit Kadakia. I'm also a joint degree student between the School of Forestry and the School of Management. I'm curious to get some words of optimism on what's the path forward, because I think both of you mentioned that this isn't just an environmental problem; it's a social problem as well. And I wonder what is the path forward, especially given that even people that live in cities do see social problems. They do interact with poverty. And we haven't really been able to solve that and to figure that out as a society. So what is the first step, and how do we start to recreate that system?
I think there's some interesting things going on at several levels. One is a lot of a lot of change is being generated at the city level. And part of it is this attention to localism, is kind of taking some of the attention and some of the energy away from looking at this global economy, which is kind of endlessly replicating itself, and looking at what is the health of a community, what are the needs of a community. So you have people in, you have Chicago painting the roofs white. You have a lot of people looking at changes in urban planning. You have a lot of small businesses that are starting to emerge in the cities along socially conscious lines. And then at the same time, you have a lot of businesses, larger businesses, that are facing cost pressures and undertaking environmental changes to kind of reduce those cost pressures, or because they actually believe in it. So you have someone like Paul Pullman at Unilever who is trying to reduce their environmental footprint, and actually I think is really committed to that. And it's a very difficult thing to do with a public company and with a company that size. Patagonia helped organize something called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is a group of over 100 companies that make more than a third of all the clothing and footwear sold in the world. And that group is working to reduce its environmental footprint. So I don't think there's any one thing. I think there's a lot going on that it's hard to see, because what we tend to see is this, we see the shell of the older economy that's in decline, and that we see the story of an economy is built around that older economy. We haven't yet built a story around the newer economy, so it becomes much harder to read.
Mm. Yeah, I very much echo that. I think, so newsflash, Walmart's stock is down by about a third in the last 3 months, 6 months, something like that. So the old economy is in decline. That the Walmart business model reached its logical limits. And as soon as that happens, there's a big adjustment. But when the news writes about Walmart dropping a third of its value, it talks about competition from Amazon and, whether it's paying its people right. It doesn't talk about, wow, there's a whole new story emerging here. And so, one of the things we do at Capital Institute is we have a project called our Field Guide to Investing in a Regenerative Economy. It's storytelling. We've got some 30 projects now that we're describing through the regenerative lens. And I think the challenge we all have, and believe me, I get plenty of moments of, call it despair, just to use a polite word. I mean, this is really hard, and it's lonely when you're talking about something as potentially profound as we're in the process of shifting our entire economic system. But as Vincent said, I mean, it's happening everywhere. It's emergent everywhere. It's just that, the mainstream news is locked into telling us a certain narrative. And, look at the politics in our country. The symptoms of a system that's in crisis and about to potentially decline is not going to be, oh, okay, let's move on to the new thing. There's going to be a fight, and it's going to get harder before it gets easier. We live in interesting times. But the fact that that's all happening, including things as horrible as 9/11, is, to me, reasons to be optimistic that, the pressure is building, so the shift is coming. So it's all of our job to find our place that's going to seem inconsequential. Believe me, I feel like what I do is inconsequential. But everyone needs to do what they're called to do based on what they see and are called to act. And that collectively is what's, I believe, going to shift things and is already happening.
Hi, I'm Megan McGrath. I'm also a joint degree between SOM and FES. And I just want to follow up on that idea. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the criteria you would use in your decision making, both from a personal standpoint and representing the organizations that you're affiliated with, on how you choose which issues to really tackle. So I think I personally, and I think many of us here, transition between feeling very excited about the opportunity with various different issues and also feeling very overwhelmed at how many issues there are and how challenging those are. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, as you know, I think one of the Patagonia's recently got into the food business, and it is what our CEO would call mouse nuts or mice nuts in terms of the overall size of the business. Is about $1 million in total.
Did you say mice nuts?
Mice nuts, yes. And but it's a tremendous passion of the Chenards, and we're also learning quite a lot about agriculture. One of the things that's really interesting that's come up in relation to grasslands is the potential for sequestering carbon. If you restore the soil, if soils become healthy, the potential for both saving water, which we're losing fresh water supply by a huge amount, and also for sequestering carbon looks to be quite major. So I'd say that one thing that we're looking at is that in agriculture, you can make really massive but fairly simple changes that can really have a profound effect on combating some of the effects of climate change. John and I were at a conference of, there were 16 CEOs, some from the food business and some from really hard office furniture and truck grill manufacturing in West Michigan, and some from engineering and construction and building the biggest building in the world in Shanghai, and a computer software person. And one of the things that was interesting is everybody glommed onto this idea of the potential of looking at the restorative effects of of agriculture, because first you can kind of see it, okay, make the soil healthy, renew that, but then the construction guys could also look at that and say, oh, the idea of regeneration in agriculture, I can use that as a metaphor for what I'm trying to do in creating a more holistic approach to buildings and communities. And the software person got very excited about the idea of this kind of integration. So that's something that's going on. There's a conversation that's going on in Patagonia right now, and also among some other people we know.
So I'll share a little story. When I left Wall Street, I was sort of the typical hard-driving male, will your way to the answers. I had exactly that, what am I going to do now? And I had a PowerPoint for, a charter school management company, and I had a PowerPoint for the American Development Bank, and I was going to will my way to the answer on how I was going to contribute and make my impact. And the truth is, I got very, I read a book called Synchronicity. And synchronicity is a Jungian idea, Jungian psychology idea that essentially is, to put it very simplistically, pay attention to the coincidences in your life. Because if you believe that there is sort of some universal energy force, you can actually tap into it. And great athletes, great artists have all talked about tapping into this energy flow. And so rather than willing my way to the answer, I just started to try to pay attention to the coincidences. And the way I got involved in the Grasslands Project is I wrote a paper. The first thing I wrote in my kind of new life, sort of my coming out of the closet experience, was called The Relevance of Schumacher in the 21st Century. And I'd read and was very inspired by Schumacher's work. And 2 months later, I got an email from Alan Savory from Zimbabwe, who had read the paper. I don't know how he got the paper. And that, he contacted me, he came to visit. We started talking about what Savory Institute's doing on the grasslands, and that led to us creating a company together, which introduced me to the idea of regeneration on the grasslands, which triggered this idea that, well, if regeneration is this idea that needs to work on the landscape, maybe, and then I heard it in the built environment, and I've gotten involved in some investment projects around real estate. And so my whole life work today was totally driven by a coincidence of some guy in Zimbabwe reading my paper. Not because I had some bright idea that grasslands is a thing. I'd never been on a ranch. So the moral of my story is synchronicity is a really powerful energy, and I'm not by any means the only one that's sort of been able to latch onto that as a way to find one's course. So another way of saying it is a little bit less of the thinking side of your brain and more of the feeling side of your brain.
Good afternoon. My name's Andrew. I'm a first year at SOM. When I was working with a number of apparel companies over the summer for a DC trade association, we were looking at traceability issues, and companies talked about how Patagonia has this competitive advantage of getting the consumers who are really interested in having organic products. If we do that, then we won't be able to compete. We'll be losing money because they already have that identity. So these companies would just do the bare minimum for traceability and looking at their supply chain. What are your responses, both of you, to that kind of corporate mindset?
Well, I think that's an excuse. I mean, we don't have a monopoly on the loyalty of people who are interested in what the social and environmental effects of their clothing is. And that's most of the, on the one hand, we don't have a monopoly on that, and on the other hand, most of the people who are buying our clothes are buying the clothes for their quality and not because of anything we're engaged in as a company. So I do think that becomes kind of an excuse. That if you say somebody else, if it doesn't give us a competitive advantage, we're not going to do the right thing. I don't think that's good business anymore. And it means, I think, that kind of thinking will tend to keep a company from looking at what their own competitive advantage might really be and what their potential for making a quality product will be if they kind of cede the ground to someone else.
Yeah, I would echo those thoughts and add to them. I think that mentality is a clear indication of being stuck in the current paradigm, and to view sustainability or whatever you want to call it as like a choice or a branding item or a product differentiator as opposed to, it's like breathing. And the challenge is not to try to replicate Patagonia. The challenge is to create an entirely new value proposition, but that is absolutely built on, core values and principles that are workable in the real world, the real context. But if you view it as, well, Patagonia is already doing that, so we'll do something different, then you're not even in the right conversation yet, I would say. And I know that's not you, that's the place that you were referring to. So.
Well, thank you very, very much, John and Vincent, for sharing your stories and your insights. And thank you all for coming. And we'll reach out about our next community lunch soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.